She started as an ordinary young woman, but later got involved in abuse, beatings, and made life and death decisions. And when World War II ended, Elisabeth Becker's crimes took her to trial. What followed was a public execution, leaving behind one of the most raw and disturbing moments from the aftermath of the war. Becker was born on July 20th, 1923, in a rural area near Danzig, which at that time was known as the Free City of Danzig, a semi-independent region caught between Germany and Poland after World War I. This place wasn't stable. It was tense, poor, and politically divided. Her family lived a basic life, likely tied to farm work or small labor, where money was limited and survival came first. For people growing up there in the 1920s and 1930s, life was not about big dreams. It was about getting through each day. As a child, there was no record showing she was violent or extreme. She went through normal schooling for that time, which was basic and often short. Many children, especially in rural areas, left school early to help their families. Becker's early years followed that same path. She worked, lived simply, and stayed within a small social world. There was nothing in her background that clearly pointed toward what she would later become. But the environment around her started shifting fast in the 1930s. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party changed everything, even in places like Danzig. By the mid-1930s, Nazi influence had spread deeply into the region. Schools began pushing Nazi ideology. Youth groups encouraged loyalty to the regime. Jobs and opportunities increasingly depended on political alignment. For young people like Becker, this wasn't something they could easily ignore. It shaped how they saw the world. At the same time, economic pressure made things worse. Jobs were scarce, especially for women without strong education or connections. Many were pushed into limited roles like domestic work, factory labor, or state-controlled jobs. The Nazi system offered something that stood out: stability, income, and a defined role. For someone coming from poverty, that mattered more than politics. This is where things started to turn. Not because she suddenly believed in extreme ideas, but because the system made itself hard to refuse. By 1944, the war had already been going on for years, and Nazi Germany was under pressure on multiple fronts. At just 21 years old, Becker entered the concentration camp system as a guard. She was sent to Stutthof concentration camp, located about 34 kilometers east of Danzig. This camp had been established back in 1939, right after Germany invaded Poland, and over time, it had grown into a major site of imprisonment and death. By the time Becker arrived, Stutthof was no longer just a detention camp. It had become part of the wider system of forced labor and extermination. Around 110,000 prisoners passed through Stutthof during its existence, including Jews, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and others considered enemies by the Nazi regime. It's estimated that around 65,000 people died there due to starvation, disease, executions, and gas chambers. This was the environment Becker stepped into. She trained as an Aufseherin, which was the title given to female guards in the SS camp system. These women were not officially part of the SS in the same way men were, but they operated under SS authority and followed the same structure. Their duties included guarding prisoners, supervising labor, and enforcing discipline. But in reality, that role went far beyond basic supervision. Inside camps like Stutthof, guards had direct control over prisoners' lives. They could punish, beat, or report prisoners, which often led to severe consequences. The power they held was immediate and physical. Becker would have seen the conditions from her very first days. Prisoners were extremely thin, often barely able to stand. Clothing was worn out, hygiene was almost non-existent. Barracks were overcrowded, sometimes holding far more people than they were built for. Disease spread quickly, especially typhus, which became a major problem in the later stages of the war. None of this was hidden from guards. The idea that camp workers didn't know what was happening doesn't hold up, especially by 1944. The suffering was visible everywhere. Dead bodies were part of daily life. Executions and punishments were routine. Instead of rejecting it, Becker adapted to it. Witnesses later described her as someone who didn't just stand by. She became active in enforcing the system. She used a whip to beat prisoners. These beatings were part of daily control. Guards often used violence to maintain order, but in many cases it went beyond that, into cruelty. She was also involved in selections. This was one of the most feared parts of camp life. Prisoners would be lined up and inspected. Those who appeared weak, sick, or unable to work were separated from the rest. For many, this meant being sent to the gas chamber or otherwise killed. These decisions weren't always made by high-ranking officers alone. Guards like Becker played a role in identifying and separating prisoners. That means she directly influenced life and death outcomes. What made this even more serious is that there's no strong evidence suggesting she was forced to act this way, under immediate threat. While the Nazi system was strict and dangerous, many guards had some level of choice in how they treated prisoners. Some were less brutal. Others, like Becker according to testimony, became more involved. Over time, this kind of environment changes people. When violence becomes normal, it stops feeling extreme. The line between discipline and cruelty disappears. By late 1944, the situation inside Stutthof concentration camp became even worse. Nazi Germany was losing the war. Supplies were running low. The Eastern Front was collapsing as Soviet forces pushed closer. Camps like Stutthof were under pressure, overcrowded, and falling into chaos. The number of prisoners increased as people were transferred from other camps and occupied territories. Barracks that were already full became packed beyond capacity. In some cases, people had no space to lie down properly. They slept on wooden bunks, often several to a level, or directly on the floor. Food was extremely limited. Daily rations dropped to survival levels, sometimes just a thin soup and a small piece of bread. Malnutrition was widespread. Prisoners lost weight rapidly and became weak. Many couldn't work properly, which then made them targets during selections. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. Without proper sanitation, clean water, or medical care, infections moved fast through the camp. Sick prisoners were often left untreated, and many died where they lay. There were times when corpses remained in the barracks because there weren't enough workers to remove them immediately. Witness testimonies from survivors described Becker's behavior during this period as aggressive and harsh. Selections became more frequent as the camp tried to manage its growing population and limited resources. At the same time, executions inside the camp increased. Some prisoners were shot. Others died slowly from starvation, exhaustion, or untreated illness. Forced labor continued, even as conditions worsened, pushing prisoners beyond their limits. Despite all of this, Becker remained in her position. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing fast. The Red Army of the Soviet Union was pushing hard from the east, and areas that had once been under tight Nazi control were now falling one after the other. Camps like Stutthof suddenly became dangerous for the SS to keep running because they were at risk of being captured along with all the evidence inside them. The SS made a decision that would turn into one of the most brutal final chapters of the war. Instead of leaving prisoners behind, they began evacuating them. On paper, this sounded like relocation, but in reality, it became what we now call death marches. Starting around January 1945, thousands of prisoners were forced out of Stutthof and its subcamps and pushed onto long marches through snow and freezing wind. Temperatures in January dropped well below zero. Many prisoners had thin clothing, worn-out shoes, and bodies already weakened by starvation and disease. They were forced to walk for days, sometimes weeks. Food was almost non-existent. Water was limited. Guards drove them forward constantly. If someone collapsed, they were often just shot on the spot. There was no system to help the weak. Survival depended on being able to keep moving, even when the body was already shutting down. Around 50,000 prisoners were evacuated from Stutthof during this period, and thousands died along the way. The roads and forests around the region became scattered with bodies. Some prisoners froze to death during the night. Others died while walking. The marches didn't follow a clean path. They moved in different directions depending on military pressure, which made the whole situation even more chaotic. Becker remained part of this system through these final months. As a guard, her role didn't stop when prisoners left the camp. Guards were responsible for controlling these marches, making sure prisoners stayed in line and continued moving. That meant she was present during this phase, where the brutality didn't decrease, it just moved outside the camp walls. At the same time, discipline among the guards started to break down. Some SS personnel realized the war was lost and tried to escape. Others removed their uniforms and attempted to blend into civilian populations. But many continued to follow orders, either out of fear, habit, or belief. There was no single pattern. It was confusion mixed with desperation. Inside Stutthof itself, the situation also became unstable. Some prisoners were left behind due to illness or because they couldn't be moved. Conditions inside the camp got even worse as supplies ran out completely. By the time Soviet forces reached the area in early May 1945, the camp had been mostly abandoned by SS personnel. What they found was overwhelming. Thousands of dead bodies were still in the camp or nearby areas. Survivors were in extremely weak condition, many unable to stand or speak properly. Disease was still spreading. The camp showed clear signs of long-term suffering, neglect, and mass death. It wasn't hidden anymore. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered, marking the end of the war in Europe. For the prisoners who survived Stutthof and the death marches, it meant freedom. But it also meant facing the reality of what they had lived through. Many had lost family members, friends, and years of their lives. But while survivors were trying to rebuild, another process began at the same time: the search for those responsible. Allied forces and local authorities across Europe started identifying and arresting individuals connected to the Nazi system. This included high-ranking officials, but also camp guards, administrators, and anyone directly involved in the operation of concentration camps. The scale of the crimes meant that investigations had to move fast. In areas that came under Polish control, authorities began organizing their own efforts to track down those responsible for crimes committed on their territory. Camps like Stutthof became central to these investigations because of the number of victims and the clear evidence left behind. Becker was eventually identified and captured. Unlike some Nazi personnel who managed to escape or hide under false identities, she did not disappear completely. Survivors who had been inside Stutthof recognized her. Her actions had been visible, and her role as a guard meant she'd been seen regularly by prisoners. This made it difficult for her to avoid being named. Once arrested, she was taken into custody and placed under investigation. Interrogations began as authorities worked to build cases against those involved in camp operations. These interrogations were detailed. Investigators wanted to understand not just who was present in the camps, but what each person actually did. During questioning, Becker used a defense that became very common among former camp personnel. She claimed she was following orders. She said she didn't have real authority and that refusing orders would have put her in danger. She presented herself as someone who was part of a larger system she couldn't control. But by this stage, investigators were no longer focusing only on the existence of orders. They were focusing on individual behavior within that system. The key question wasn't just whether someone was present, but how they acted. Survivor testimonies played a major role here. Former prisoners came forward and described what they'd experienced. They connected her directly to acts of violence and control. At the same time, investigators compared statements, checked records, and built a clearer picture of her role. By mid-1945 and into 1946, enough evidence had been gathered to move forward with formal charges. By 1946, the focus in post-war Poland had shifted fully toward justice. The crimes committed inside Stutthof were too large and too visible to ignore. So Polish authorities organized a series of trials specifically targeting the people who'd worked there. These trials became known as the Stutthof trials. and they were separate from the bigger international trials like Nuremberg. These were local, direct, and focused on what happened inside that one camp. Becker was brought before a Polish court as part of the first major Stutthof trial in 1946, held in the city of Gdansk, which had just come under Polish control after the war. She was not alone. Around her were other former guards and officials, both men and women, all facing charges related to crimes committed inside that camp. Some had higher ranks, others were lower-level personnel, but they were all being judged for their roles in the same system. The court proceedings moved quickly compared to modern standards. There was no long delay. The war had just ended, evidence was fresh, and survivors were still nearby. The courtroom became a place where those survivors could finally speak openly about what had happened. Many of them had spent months or years inside Stutthof, and they came forward to describe their experiences in detail. The trial itself didn't drag on for years. It moved fast because the goal was to establish responsibility and deliver judgment. By the end of the proceedings, the court reached a decision based on the evidence and testimonies presented. Becker was found guilty of crimes against prisoners. The sentence was death. This wasn't unusual for cases involving direct involvement in killings or extreme brutality. Several other defendants in the same trial also received death sentences, while others were given long prison terms depending on their level of involvement. But what made Becker's case stand out wasn't just the verdict. It was what came next. On July 4, 1946, the sentence against her was carried out near the former grounds of Stutthof concentration camp, not far from Gdansk. The location itself mattered. This wasn't chosen randomly. Executing those responsible close to the place where the crimes happened made the moment feel more direct, almost like a final connection between what had been done and the punishment that followed. The method was hanging, which was commonly used in these post-war executions in Poland. But this wasn't done behind closed doors. It was a public execution, meaning ordinary people were allowed to gather and watch. A large crowd formed that day. Among them were survivors of the camp, people who had lost their family members, and locals who had lived near Stutthof and had seen the effects of the camp during the war. The atmosphere was intense from the beginning. This wasn't just a legal event, it was emotional. For many in the crowd, this moment represented justice after years of fear, loss, and suffering. At the same time, there was tension because public executions are unpredictable. They don't always go smoothly, especially in the immediate aftermath of war, when systems are still unstable. Becker was brought to the gallows along with other condemned guards from the same trial. They were placed on trucks under the structure, a method sometimes used in these executions. Instead of a traditional drop platform, the trucks would drive away, leaving the condemned hanging. It sounds simple, but in practice, it could be rough and uneven. Accounts from that day describe the process as chaotic. There were delays in organizing the execution. The setup wasn't precise. When the moment came, it didn't happen cleanly or instantly. Hanging, especially without a proper drop, often leads to a slower death rather than immediate neck break. That means the person can struggle for several minutes. This is what made the scene difficult to watch. What makes this execution stand out even more is that it was partially recorded. Footage from the event still exists today, showing parts of what happened. This wasn't staged or edited. It was a real moment captured as it unfolded, which is why it continues to be discussed even decades later. By the end of that day, Becker was dead. She was 23 years old. Her life had started in a quiet, rural area, but it ended in front of a crowd, tied to one of the darkest chapters of World War II. And the way it ended left behind an image that still stays with people. Not because it was dramatic or controlled, but because it was real.